So thank you all for joining us for this first public talk of 2021, put on by our Energy Institutes here at the University of Melbourne, the Centre for Exciton Science and the Melbourne Energy Institute. Thank you all for making the effort to come here in person. I know you probably all prefer to have come here via Zoom, but we thought it was about time we sort of shake everyone out of their trees a little bit and get people back face to face, enjoying each other's company and listening to some stimulating conversations. So thank you all for making the effort to come along tonight. We're meeting here on the lands of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to acknowledge their contributions as traditional custodians of the lands and water on which we are now working and meeting. I'd like to recognise in particular the scientific achievements of the traditional custodians, and we pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. So welcome everyone. Thank you very much for making the effort on a beautiful Melbourne night to come here and discuss something about energy and our future. We hope you'll find it really stimulating. My name is Paul Mulvaney. I'm actually the director of one of the centres that's sponsoring this meeting, the Centre for Exciton Science. If we're very lucky, by the end of the evening, we might all know what an exciton is. I've been trying to find out for ages. And my fellow presenter is Michael Breer, who directs the Melbourne Energy Institute. And the goals of our institutes are to bring people together from traditional disciplines to try and just talk about energy as a problem and think about solutions. Where are we going in the world right now? What are the challenges? And the challenges are not simply scientific, they're social, technological, political. We don't really know what solutions are going to end up actually governing the way we live in future, but we do know that fossil fuels are running out and that we need to start looking for change. So we've got two great speakers here tonight to help us with that. First of all, we have Professor Anita Ho-Baillie from the University of Sydney. She's come all the way down here to talk to us, as has Professor Jasieniak from Monash University. They're both scientists passionate about solar energy and how that can help us reach a more sustainable energy future. They're going to talk a little bit, and then we're going to have some Q&A, which I'm hoping Michael will moderate. And then hopefully, if you're still stimulated enough, you'll come out and have some drinks afterwards and chat. Please chat to our speakers and ask them some questions. You'll also see out there in the foyer that we've actually been running a poster session. It's called Light Ideas, and you can have a look at the final entries for that poster competition, which are out there. See if you can work out which one was the winner, and you can actually put in your own votes for what you think are the most exciting ideas on how light can be integrated into the future of our cities. With that, I'd like to ask our first speaker, Anita, to perhaps come up and talk to us about solar cities, smart cities, transforming the urban energy landscape. Thanks, Anita.
Thank you, Paul. So you can hear me well? So thanks for having me in a very sunny Melbourne. I'm from rainy Sydney today. And thanks for inviting me to speak in this beautiful building. So my architect husband diligently looked up the building, and his comment is the building is very utilitarian and imposing. So I think you just take it as a compliment when architects speak. So today we're going to talk about solar city and smart city. So I will talk about how do we do solar smarter, and I think Jack is going to talk about how do we do city smarter. So I will talk about smart solar from the technology point of view. So as you know, renewables is going to places, and 3 years ago, a quarter of our electricity comes from renewables. Now it's 27%. And in terms of PV, the global average is 3%. So in Australia, it's around 9% actually. 9% of our energy comes from solar. And the highest is actually in Honduras, 14%. And in Europe, for example, in Italy, Germany, and Greece is around 8%. So the cost of PV is coming down dramatically, 10 times in the last 10 years, and that's because of the economies of scale. So jobs and growth, PV is doing it all. So even though PV makes up 10% of total renewables, it's actually providing 33% of the jobs worldwide. So at the moment, there are at least 4 million people, direct jobs being employed in PV. And of course, there are indirect jobs as well. There are financiers, there are other people in civil engineering doing all the groundwork. and their policy makers as well. So the incumbent technology is silicon. So what you have on your roof, the solar panel is made of silicon. And it's not an easy, it's cheap, but actually it takes a long route to make the solar panels. So you start from sand, quartzite, you purify it to 98.5%, and then you go through 2 days long of high temperature process to purify it further to 99.9999%. We call it 6N purity silicon. Then you remelt it and grow it into single crystalline silicon to have as little defects as possible in the silicon ingot. And then you slice it, and then it goes through another 1,000-degree process to make the PN junction. And I'll talk more about what semiconductor is. Anyway, so once you've got the solar cell, you line them up, and then you connect them in series like you would do with the lights on the Christmas tree. And then you encapsulate it between glass and a backsheet. And voila, you got a solar panel. So it does have a lot of energy embedded into the panel because it's got this expensive glass and the aluminium as well. So silicon has existed for the last 40 years. It's taken 40 years for the efficiency to double. So you can see you got the efficiency, you got the efficiency on the y-axis and the time in the x-axis. And you can see all the different types of solar cell technology. So the ones that are purple are the ones used for space, and they are of high efficiency, but they're very expensive. They're $3,000 per square meter. Okay, so can we do solar smarter? Yes. So we're not going to stay with the existing technology, which is 20% efficient. So how do we do it? Well, we can introduce multifunctions into a solar panel, and that is done by integration. So to give you an example, we used to use phones as phones, and then we found out you can actually carry the phone around. And then some bright spark decided to integrate cameras into phones, and now people don't use phones as phones, even though I still do. But young people don't use the phone as phones anymore. They use it for all sorts of stuff. So in terms of solar panel, we can do the same thing. So why don't we integrate solar cells into windows and insulated glazing? So we have a project where we have solar cell in between two pieces of glass. So it could be a vacuum in between, or air, or inert gas. And the idea is to have smart solar where it does thermal insulation, sound barrier, light control, and energy generation. So in our research, we focus on looking at the solar window as a whole system and looking at the heat transfer, what it does to the solar cell and what it does to the internal habitants. And Jack will talk more about, how do you actually realize semi-transparent windows and all sorts of other things and the potentials of multifunctional solar products. So there's another way of doing solar smarter is by having multi-junctions. And again, is by integration, integrating cells on top of each other. So the idea is to have that top curve over there, so you can see the wiggle up there, and the point is to increase the performance of the cell well beyond what is shown here. So as you know, there are one bodies doing the install, glass is expensive, aluminium frame is expensive, and we're only 20% at the moment. There is still 80% of solar energy to be harnessed. So how do we do it? We stack solar materials on top of each other, and as you increase the number of junctions, the efficiency increase from the theoretical limit of 30% to 55%. So, so how does it work? So I'll probably talk a bit about, I'll give you just a very, very small lecture on solar cell 101. So solar cell is made of semiconductor, and it's got this idea of band gap. So what it means is if you have a piece of semiconductor and you give it enough energy, for example, light, where the photon has an energy higher than the band gap of the semiconductor, you'll be able to excite the electrons in the semiconductor, and the electrons will become free electrons that will be conductive. So you make the material from an insulator to a conductor. However, if you shine light onto the solar cell and the energy of the photon is below the band gap, it does nothing. So it still sits as an insulator. Okay, so we have silicon cell on our roof. So what happens? So it's got a band gap of 1.1 eV. That means you need light with photon energy that is higher than 1.1 eV. So it's capable of absorbing red, absorbing yellow, green, blue, ultraviolet, violet light, because they all have a band gap more than 1 eV. In fact, they have a band gap of around 2. So what happens when you have photon energy that is way above what the semiconductor needs, way above the band gap? It actually gets wasted as heat, and therefore is only 20% efficient. So we call it the thermalization loss. And what happens if you have the long wavelength, the infrared light? That actually passes straight through the silicon and it doesn't get absorbed. So why don't we stack solar cell materials with different band gaps on top of each other? So starting with the very high band gap material where it absorbs the UV light really well, and let the blue and the green and the yellow pass through, and then feed it to the next stack. And then the next stack is the green and yellow and red, and infrared goes to the very bottom of the solar cell. So by doing that, you can see the efficiency increase from 33% to 55% for 4-junction cells. So as you go higher, the increase is marginal, and therefore there's a trade-off. You don't want to make the solar cell so complex that the additional gain is not worth it. So what material can we use? Well, if you look at the graph carefully, on the right-hand side you can see, I've got a yellow sort of highlight there. There's this new material called metal halide perovskites. We know it exists since 1893, but it's only been used for solar cell in the last 10 years. And you can see the curve is very steep. It took only 10 years for the efficiency to double, whereas for the other technology, it took 40 years. So what is perovskite? Well, it's got a chemical formula of ABX3 and got a crystal structure like that. So the A side is an organic cation, and then the B side is where the metal sits. It's got lead, germanium or tin, and then the X side is the iodide, the chloride, and the bromide where the halide sits. And you can see Eg is band gap. You can see that as you tune the composition of the material, you can change the band gap of the material. So that makes this material very versatile. Whereas with silicon, it's only one band gap. You can't do much about it. Also, it's got a really good absorption coefficient. It absorbs light with very little material. So you have a piece of hair, for example, average hair width is 70 microns. And a piece of silicon solar cell is 3 times as thick as your piece of hair. Whereas with the perovskite cell, it's under 1 micron. So it's 200 times thinner than the silicon cell. That means you use very little material for making this solar cell. So it's low cost, and it's got higher power to weight ratio. So why does it matter? Because you can integrate it on vehicles and spacecraft. So it's 10 times more power per weight than the 3.5 cells used in space. Another attractive attribute of the perovskite cell is you can actually fabricate it using solution process. So you mix the cation, the AB salt or the BX salt, you put it in the solvent, and you can spray it, you can print it onto a piece of substrate, which can be flexible or glass. You give it a temperature of 100 degrees, not 1,000 that you will use for silicon, 100 to 200 degrees, and voila, you get the photoactive material here. So you can see the color change. That means it's absorbing orange light and above. So what do we do in our lab? We put the perovskite directly onto the silicon cell to make the tandem. So there are 2 ways of doing it. Either you make a perovskite cell and silicon cell, and then you just stack one on top of each other with all the wires dangling, or you directly print or spray the perovskite cell on top of the silicon cell. So we call it the monolithic integration. Our lab also make this cell that is practical size. So a lot of labs, they make a tiny, teeny one. But because we're working with industry partner, we actually make it on realistic cell size. We also make sure that our tandem cell is compatible with the existing technology. So here's a graph where the orange histogram, the orange part of the histogram is the the majority, where the majority of the silicon technology is. So the orange graph represents the PERT silicon technology that originates from Australia, from UNSW, and is contributing to 90% of the market. So there's another technology called heterojunction cell, and is represented by the grey, and there's a Japanese technology. So you can it's still ramping up. So we make sure that when we make our perovskite cell and put it on silicon, we can pull out any cell from any manufacturer in the world, and we can still demonstrate that technology. So we've also done some cost analysis. You can see that up there, there's a curve that is 0 here, and that's the break-even point. What it is saying is we can afford to make a perovskite cell on silicon cell if the perovskite cell costs, for example, below $2, and if it gives the efficiency gain of 5% or above, then the manufacturer are making money. So, and that's possible. So our cost estimation is saying we can make the perovskite cell at $1.50 per cell, and we can, as we demonstrated, we can increase the efficiency by 5% at least. So to wrap up, so there's a catch in there. It assumes that perovskites will last as long as the silicon cell. So that's the holy grail of perovskite cells. They're prone to thermal stress and moisture. So it's very important that we protect the cells from degradation. So last year we cracked it. We managed to stabilize the perovskite cells using very low cost encapsulation. So the encapsulation technique that we use has to be low temperature as well, because perovskite doesn't like high temperature. And we use a technique that is commonly used for double glazing. So we managed to get the cells to pass the stringent IEC testing standards, long hours of dam heat, a lot of thermal cycling. We make it really hot, make it really cold, and then introduce water crystals as well, see if we can introduce it into the cell, and then freeze it. So it turns out our cells actually perform better than the requirements by IEC standard. So another breakthrough is we use this technique called GCMS to look at how cells degrade if they're unprotected. So why is it important? Because if you don't know how cells degrade, you don't know how to protect it. At the moment, we've got another project where we look at 3-junction tandem. We're stacking perovskite on perovskite and onto silicon. So to sum up, how do we do solar better? Well, there also other ways of doing solar better. For example, why don't we just bypass the electric wires and have the solar cell directly exposed to electrochemical reactions? So what we can do is we can use solar cell to directly split water to produce hydrogen or oxygen, or we can expose the solar cell into a redox electrolyte reaction so that we actually store the electrical energy in the form of chemical energy. So you can imagine we used to have some solar hot water system where we have tubes with water running along the tubes on your roof and then let the sun heat it up. But what if we replace the water with a redox couple and we put solar directly on top and store the solar energy in those tubes on your rooftop? So last year we managed to demonstrate a solar flow battery that is got nearly 100% utilization rate. Anyway, I think that's it for my talk, and thanks very much for listening, and I'll pass on to Jack.
What I'll do is I'll talk about the deployment of this technology. Solar photovoltaics, different types of photovoltaics, and to really ask a simple question, which is, how do we transform a really large urban landscape? And for this experiment, we've chosen one type of city, Melbourne. We're here. We thought it would be appropriate to choose the most livable city, and maybe we can also be one of the most energy efficient ones, but time will tell. So before jumping in there, let me ask you a question. Over the last, I don't know, 5 years, 10 years, what's been the most significant event that has impacted your life? COVID. COVID. No, it wasn't Hawthorn losing to Melbourne. I don't know who's a Hawthorn supporter. It was COVID, right? Now we feel it every day, every one of us here. Probably we're a little bit buffered here compared to the rest of the world. If you look here, the World Economic Forum analyses risk, okay? And if you look risk, this is likelihood on the bottom and impact on this side here, impact. And if you look right up here, the highest impact you can get and the likelihood, what do you see? Well, you can't really see that, so I've blown it up for you a little bit. Infectious disease, well, hello. COVID, we've got COVID right here, and sitting right next to it with a higher likelihood is climate change. Now, these are existential risks. It means they impact our humanity if we don't address them. Now, ultimately, there's a debate around climate change and how we address it. Now, I believe these guys, World Economic Forum, they've got some pretty keynote economists from around the world. The difference here is that we're feeling this now. In fact, we weren't feeling it a few years ago. This risk was sitting all the way down here. It jumped up over the last year, surprise, surprise. I'm still surprised it's not at a high likelihood given that we're in it, right? But in any case, climate change in these reports seems to have a 5 to 10 year horizon plan. That's when we're going to start to feel the impact, right? But we haven't started to feel it yet. What we do know, what this does give us a bit of a reference for, is what level of impact we would be expecting. And if COVID-19 is anything to measure that by, we should be ready for something that is going to be quite interesting and quite life-changing. So how do we address it? Well, if you look at the literature, everything comes down to carbon reductions. Our good friend carbon dioxide, this actually is inclusive of other greenhouse emissions. But you can see here, this is the increasing carbon trend over time. We've got this dip, it's a nice dip. No one was driving, no one was leaving the house during COVID-19. Industries closed down. That's why there's this dip. As the world recovers, well, how's that next trajectory going to fly? That's the question, okay? If we keep going along the pre-COVID-19 trend, we are going to feel the repercussions of climate change. So what we need to think about are deep decarbonisation pathways that happen as quickly as possible. Deep decarbonisation, right? At a scale that we've never been able to do in the past. Now, where do we target that deep decarbonisation? So here's a pie chart plot of different sectors and where carbon emissions currently reside. You can see industries here. Well, there's a lot of efforts needed to decarbonise industry. Hydrogen will play a role, etc., etc. Transport, well, electrification, maybe hydrogen will play a role. Other, and this little guy here, buildings. By little, it's almost 30%. Okay? 30% arises from buildings. Now, if we take that a little bit more, there's a couple of trends that we need to be aware of. The first one is that our population is increasing. Okay? We're going to be at about 9 billion people in the world by 2050. What that means is that the number of buildings out there is going to increase. In fact, these projections indicate that the number of houses will go from about 2.2 billion to over 3 billion over this time period. Okay? Now, in that same time, there's this transition period where some of that home energy that's being produced is currently produced from renewables. Probably a little bit high, I would imagine here, 36. That transition has to involve decarbonisation of building operations, okay? Now, in the simplest sense, that includes, okay, coupling to wind, coupling to renewable energy sources like solar panels that Anita talked about. I won't talk too much into detail here, but this is moving away from gases and other sources to electrification, okay? Because we've got very efficient systems now that enable us to heat, cool, and provide basic function. So given all this, one would imagine that what we're going to do is we're going to quite simply put big solar installations out there in the middle of the Pilbara or elsewhere. Okay? We're going to transport all that electricity, and we're going to use it in Melbourne, and we're going to use it in Perth, we're going to use it in Sydney, and maybe that's a reality, right? But maybe it's not, right? And that's the question here. So what is the reality of buildings? What is the reality of these types of urban environments? And so building integrated is going to play a role. And that's where I would like to pose and ask you the question, well, will it? Well, we can think about that over the next 10 minutes. So if you look here, the transition that I'm proposing is one where we go from basic solar, sitting on a rooftop, to something that's integrated. And Anita talked about solar window technology that she's working on. Well, that's one of those technologies here. But at the same time, there's also walls, right? Walls that can actually be made from silicon, right? But it's just, instead of having a wall that's just concrete, you have a functional wall that's generating electricity. So if you take that market, the building integrated market, we're seeing a couple of trends. One, it's going to continue to increase. Now these aren't big numbers, you know, $5 billion. You look at the global PV market, photovoltaic market, it's around 400 billion, okay? Here's a niche. But niche is where things start, right? So this will continue to grow. We're seeing glass, wall, rooftop, all increasing in this area. And secondly, we're seeing that silicon is going to play a really big role. Now, yes, it's old, yes, it's cheap, which is great, but it's established, so it's going to play a role. At the same time, there's alternate technologies that are going to start to grow. And so what are those alternative technologies? Anita talked about perovskites, and I think perovskites might very well be one of those technologies. But let's not forget that there are alternatives. Okay, and here are a few. Some of them are already commercial, up the top. Amorphous silicon, fantastic technology. Been around for about 40 years, if not a bit longer. But it's low efficiency, it's hard to integrate, it's got poor transmittance. There's a number of things keeping it not viable for integration into buildings. Then you've got these other ones, dye-sensitized solar cells, organic solar cells. We've got Dave Jones there who works on those types of technologies there. In fact, we've got Jerry Wilson and Scott Watkins who were pioneering this work up at CSIRO 10 years ago. Okay? Great technologies, low efficiency, low stability. So each technology has its pros, each technology has its cons. But ultimately, they're all low efficiency, right? That's what perovskite has changed. And Anita showed the increase of photovoltaic efficiency in perovskites. So what we've been doing is looking at how to structure perovskite solar cells to maximise light transmission whilst maximising the efficiency that that solar cell generates, right? So this is how a solar cell looks. This is a perovskite cell. I'm not going to be talking too much detail. It's a multi-layered structure, right? Like a sandwich, okay? And what we're doing here is we're optimizing the electrodes. So the electrodes have to be transmittance or transmissive to light, right? We're optimizing the actual interfaces across each of these layers, and we're changing the composition of that perovskite. And again, Anita showed that variability in perovskite composition can give you widely different properties, okay? So by doing all of these innovations, we're starting to play around with exactly those parameters that we're trying to achieve. High efficiency, right, at high light transmittance, okay? And this simple curve, this is efficiency and this is transmittance. It shows you that after about 40%, below 40%, perovskites are just exceptionally good, okay? So this is amorphous silicon, commercial. In fact, this is probably a little bit high. It's of the order of 2 to 3 times higher than amorphous silicon, and that's being conservative, okay? Now, buildings sit here. That's the hot spot, right? About 30% transmittance. So for this technology, we're getting about 10%, okay? That's remarkable. At that efficiency, at that transmittance, amorphous silicon is about 2, okay? So this gives us a tool, and I would say it's a tool to produce energy. It's a technology, right? And these are our tools. These are our production tools. We've got rooftop photovoltaics, silicon, fantastic technology, right? We've got wall integrated photovoltaics, silicon, fantastic technology. And we've got our solar window technology based on perovskites. These are some of the efficiencies that you can get. I'd just like to point out here, Maria, who did some of this work, she's actually sitting over there, and I just want to say it's actually the first time I've met her on this project because we've done this entire project during COVID. So it's a 1-year-long project and it's the first time. So this is how different the world is these days. Anyhow, that was a little anecdote. So what we're doing here is we're asking a simple question. How do we apply these types of technologies to understand the solar potential of Melbourne as a city, right? So point number one, we have to make the CBD. Well, how do you make a virtual CBD, right? Well, the first thing you need to do is you need to understand your terrains. We have pretty high spatial resolution. We use particular databases then to understand when buildings were built, what type of buildings were built. And a lot of this work was actually done at UniMelb here. We understand then the building footprints, which includes heights and exactly their boundaries. Now, when you have all that information, you elevate. Like God, you elevate the entire city virtually, and you get these beautiful 3D reconstructions. So you take that then, and then what you're doing is you're then assessing how light goes onto the city. Right? So that's a block, that's a 500 by 500 metre block. And then what we do is we have solar, and then we model exactly how the sun rises and sets seasonally over the entire year. And obviously it changes, right? Winter sits north, summer sits more above, okay? We pick up that variation and we model it in terms of the surface intensity, right? Irradiance here. So these red spots are where it's really high intensity. And then we apply a filter. And the filter is, if we have a certain surface, how much solar irradiance do we need for that surface to be actually viable for being used as a solar cell, right? Now that number was included a few slides ago, and we can talk about it later, but there's a particular threshold that we put up for the windows and the solar cells and the rooftops and the walls. And so we get a map. And this map starts to visualize exactly the surfaces that enable us to be able to be used for solar cell collection or solar collection across different surfaces. So this is how it looks. Now, we map this out. This is across the entire CBD, right? So we can start to map this out across, this is a matrix here. You can see there's 300 or so blocks, and you can start to visualize the roof solar, the solar windows, and the solar windows, the solar walls and solar window components. So I've got a little question here, right? We integrate this, right? And we can get the overall solar potential for the entire CBD. So that's what we're doing quite simply. It's taken a lot of work, okay? I'm simplifying it. But I'll ask you a question, okay? What do you think is the solar potential of all PV technologies for meeting Melbourne's CBD electricity demands, right? Is it less than 10%? Is it between 10 to 50%? Or is it more than 50%? All right, so this is an interactive part. A, who thinks A? Less than 10%, okay? 2, who thinks B? Most people. C, ambitious. Ambitious, I like it. That's the way we should be. The answer is, based on this simulation, this is an upper estimate, is that up to 74% of the electricity demand can actually be met through photovoltaics. So you ambitious folks, well done. You've passed the test, okay?
And it's only for daytime, not considering the night time?
It's everything. All demand.
So it's including...
Without storage.
Including storage.
Yes, that would be assuming it's a balance, right? You'd have to balance. And that's a good question, storage. What's the rub? We'll pose that question. Now, what's interesting is when you analyze the contributions of that from the different photovoltaic technologies, you actually find that rooftop solar cell contributes to almost 90% of that, right? And that's because Melbourne CBD is a very diverse urban environment. It's got large warehouses, it's got high-rise buildings, it's very dense, very, very diverse. So in actual fact, silicon as a rooftop installation is a fantastic technology, right? In fact, it's low-hanging fruit. It's low-hanging fruit. It surprises me that when you go to a city, Melbourne CBD, you don't see enough. You don't see that many solar cells, right? Given the potential here. Then you've got wall and you've got windows as well. Now, looking at this, as someone who works on solar windows, you'd be going, oh, this hurts, right? That's where you have to do a little bit of digging, okay? So what we're doing here is we're looking at different regions here, and you can see different suburbs and suburb areas, and you can see the breakdown. In fact, some areas are obviously Port Melbourne, big warehouses, larger rooftop potential. You move more into the high-rise buildings, you start to get more and more solar window configurations or potential there. Makes sense, right? Okay. So in these cases, you're starting to see values of the order of 16 to 20% and above for the wall-to-window ratios. You can go a little bit deeper than that. And here we're taking a block of Melbourne CBD, this is block 5, quite a high energy consumption or electricity consumption region. And you can see that over the year, this is the consumption data seasonally, it's a little bit peaky in winter time just because of the heating, but it's high. But if you then track the actual solar cell output, right, you're seeing something distinct, right? It's reducing, right? It's obvious. The capacity factors of solar cells, rooftop, are reduced during the winter time because the sun is north and also you have shorter days, right? Two factors that work against you for solar cells when you don't have any sort of tracking. But, and this is where my positivity comes in. If you look here, one thing doesn't really change, and that's our solar windows. So if you look here and you actually average this out over total solar potential, the contribution of these windows actually starts to increase, right? It doesn't get impacted as much seasonally as normal photovoltaics. And that's purely because it's sitting on a window and the sun is becoming more and more north during winter, right? And it's actually getting more direct light onto that solar panel. And on top of that, you've got solar panels on more than one surface, right? So you can start to see the benefits here. You don't have to worry about that angular drop in silicon. In fact, you can see it a little bit more. This is my final slide here. When we look at two buildings, and I just want to compare, this is Victoria, 1 apartments, and Melbourne Central Tower offices. This one has rooftop. This one is all glazing, all glass, right? And I just want you to see here, this is the performance here of the solar windows over that year, right? And these are days, summer, winter. Okay, we had a bad day. It was cloudy. It's Melbourne. Sorry, Anita. It happens. It was bad. But if you actually look at it, it's pretty consistent, right? So you can have consistent performance of your photovoltaics across summer and winter, and yet still be producing a year, you know, giga watt hours of energy, right? This is huge amounts of energy, right, for this type of building. Now, we couldn't get the consumption data here because of consumers, but consumer protection laws, but our estimates are that it would meet about 15 to 30% of the consumption, depending on the building. You can also see that in silicon, the case of silicon here, you're dropping. So this particular building, you actually see that silicon, the dark line, dropping right off. But at the same time, this particular building is very well constructed for solar. It's a high rise, has a lot of windows. You can actually see this one starts to pick it up, right? So in some instances, solar windows actually give you more benefit than silicon, right, than the existing technologies. So this makes me question and ask the question, well, what is the role of these silicon photovoltaics on rooftops? And can we start to think about buildings as a hybrid system that can be complemented? And maybe one day they will just have constant photovoltaic outputs, right? That don't change seasonally, that align up with the usage patterns of those particular buildings. So to finish, I did say one last slide. This is kind of a cheeky slide. Just some final thoughts. Well, how will these actually develop in urban environments? We don't see them, really. They're not as prevalent as on households. What do we need to do? Is it a policy question, like Paul said? Do we need something around self-powered buildings as part of the national agenda? What's the role of energy storage, right? Absolutely, that was a great question before. How do we do that, right? We need to think about energy storage. There's this concept called renewable energy zones by EMO. It's all done in rural parts of Australia. Maybe a city could be a renewable energy zone. Why not? If it could meet that amount of electricity demand, then surely that would be classified as a renewable energy zone. That's a complete rethinking of the urban environment that we live in. Complete rethinking. So this is the final one, which is, well, what would an ideal and practical greenfield, new development city look like? We've pasted solar cells onto the existing fabric, but the future might not be, so it might be completely different if you're redeveloping it. The city landscape might be looking completely different. So with that, I apologise for going a little bit over time. Just wanted to thank, and I do compete with Anita on the science, but actually more so on the jumps. So with that, thanks very much.
Hello everyone, I'm Michael Breer, I'm Director of the Melbourne Energy Institute, and I'll invite Anita and Jack to come up and join me on the panel. We'll do 5 or 10 minutes of Q&A, the usual thing, and then we'll open questions from everyone here tonight. And then we'll have a few drinks afterwards and a bit of general chat. So thank you, both of you. And I can't jump as high as either of them, so we'll all sit down. So thank you for coming all the way to Melbourne, and thank you for coming into the CBD. And thanks everyone for coming for a face-to-face event. This is great, and it's great for universities to be doing what we've been doing for over 1,000 years, which is getting together and sharing ideas and learning collectively. So more and more face-to-face, the better. Hopefully vaccinated and healthy at the same time. The CBD analysis, Jack, I want to ask a bit about that, and because I think it's very interesting actually, and I was quite surprised. I was the middle band. I wasn't one of the optimists or the pessimists. I'm a moderate kind of guy, as you know. That's why I'm moderator. And what about outside the CBD? I was thinking of my house, and it's got walls as well as a roof. Have you done those numbers for homes and apartments and things like that as well?
Yeah, we have. Because there's so much rooftop in households, rooftop's going to dominate. So the question there is, how do you convert as much rooftop into photovoltaics? And I would still say it's moving away from solar on roof to rooftops. I think that's a transition. Apartments is a little bit more questionable because it depends on the type of apartment. And we've done that analysis as well. And if you get quite large apartments, 5 to 10 stories or so, you start to get appreciable gains in terms of wall and window, right? And in those instances, you can get 20 to 30% of your electricity demands being met. Again, but usually those have large rooftops as well. So it's sort of a compromise in that case.
But
yeah.
I don't know about everyone here, I'm guessing we're all regularly surprised by the new 3 or 4 story thing that's going in our local neighbourhood, often apartments, often aged care facilities, often on main roads. We're making the city much higher population density throughout. So as that evolves, there could be quite a lot of that.
Yep.
And it ties in with...
Can I ask a question?
Of course you can.
Allowed?
Of course you can.
So have you looked at balcony glass, like balustrades, the glass on the balconies?
We haven't looked at it, but that is a prime candidate for these types of technologies.
It's pretty wasted, isn't it?
It's a total waste of real estate.
Very good.
Yeah.
I always think about glass on buildings and think how buildings are often just glass, and it can't be that much more expensive to make a bit of power out of those things. But anyway, that's just a thought. But Anita, you brought up that lovely picture of the phone, or the phones.
Yeah.
And
I grew up with the, with the one.
You didn't have the Bakelite phone, which I grew up with, but my kids do more of that and this than that, as you pointed out. But that talks about talking to this, a new technology comes along and enables something which we didn't even think about before.
Yes.
And I would like to draw that out a bit more, and it's probably Jack as well, jump in, but these tandem junction, triple junction, so on, that's got to offer quite substantial changes and further improvements in all sorts of solar over the next 10, 20 years. Yep. Do you have an idea of what kind of changes that might mean? You know, I won't be using an iPad in 5 years' time, maybe. What would I have for my solar farm or my window or whatever in 10 years' time with that kind of change? How do you see that happening?
I think it will enable more niche applications. So, for example, you know, the idea of putting solar cells on the back of your phone, for example, with the existing technology, it won't be enough to charge your phone. So it's just, you know, trickling tiny bits of electrons onto your phone, and your phone is just sapping energy. But imagine you can have a very, very high performance solar cell on your devices, on the back of your computer. Because this solar cell is quite area intensive, so, you know, you want more current, you simply increase the size of your panel. But if you can have a 50-60% efficient cell, then you don't need as much area. So, you know, people talking about vehicles with solar panels.
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, on the bonnet, on the glass. At the moment, with the kind of efficiency we're looking at, again, it's just trickling. It's not going to do too much to the vehicle itself. So, yeah, so I think enabling the niche applications yeah, it's just massive deployment of those high efficiency cells. And at cost, you know, we're looking at space as well for space applications. Yep. At the moment, we're using very high efficiency cells, but also very costly cells. Can we look at the low cost alternatives? 42,000 satellites that Elon Musk is going to put on space, and CubeSats and, yeah, low-cost satellites. So, yeah.
You could put PV on a car and Elon Musk can send that into space, perhaps. but if you double the efficiency of a solar cell, yep, and you don't, and a solar module is only a small part of a total solar installation now, that's got to change things. I mean, we're already winning on solar, right? It's already really cost effective, so that's got to say we haven't seen much yet, doesn't it?
The efficiency gains for when you're space constrained, like in the city, I mean, that 74 goes up to 100 and something %. Your renewable energy zone, if you can make that step jump. Yeah. And I think that, you know, 50, 60 years from now, we will hopefully, if these technologies like Anita's working on eventuate, you know, we will produce more electricity than we need, and that's the dream. Yeah. So it's not unrealistic to think that these big transmission lines don't have to connect up to cities, right? It's not that unrealistic. And that's the kind of step change that I think this type of technology could enable.
But what happens to a national electricity market if you don't have to have transmission to and from cities?
Well, we have to ask the economists who designed it.
Oh, you shouldn't ask those questions, Jack. Anyway, we're going to ask some other questions, which is questions from everyone here. So, questions from the floor. We have a couple of roving microphones, and we have one hand up straight away. So, we've got two hands up straight away.
Thank you so much. This is Rebecca from RMIT University. I know Anita. So I'm leading a research lab on solar energy application. So we work on BIPV application in cities and buildings. So I believe my question is to Jacek. It's very interesting study on the solar cities. However, based on our collection on the commercialized BIPV products globally, we collected more than 70 products in our database. Of course, the efficiency technology, they are different. However, in consider to use BIPV into buildings, it's not only about efficiency. It's also about building regulations, especially related to fire. That's a major issue when we consider PV windows or PV walls. So I just wonder, how do you consider this? Because once you take that into consideration, from my experience, this is my database, there are a lot of differences in terms of where you can use that actually.
Yeah, look, it's a fantastic question, and I don't work in that safety space, and I think that's a legislation question, also a structure question as well. There are examples of photovoltaics that are integrated BIPV photovoltaics, so there is a genuine question around how do you safely install high density or propensities of building integrated photovoltaics in windows and walls. I think that's a technical challenge, but equally, unpacking that safety regulation and seeing how it can be progressed through better technology development needs to happen, absolutely. Thank you for raising it.
We had another question at the front here.
My daughter is an assessor in the insurance industry, and she tells me a lot of interest she has and projects she works on for claims on smashed solar panels. Is there anything being done to strengthen the surface of the solar panel?
Well, actually, they're pretty robust. They have a hull test in the IEC standard. So, you know, in the old days, they even have a bullet test, maybe for military, I don't know, for remote energy generation for military sites. So usually the weakest points of solar panels is actually on the edges. So if the packaging is not done right on the edge, this is usually what happens. So if you have a hailstone that falls right in the middle of the panel, you don't see cracks. But if it's on the edge and it's not done right, then yeah, you will have that problem.
May I follow on? She presented a map of from northern New South Wales around through parts of Queensland where the insurance companies will not finance back solar panels.
Mm-hmm.
So we were working at CSIRO for years on flexible solar cells, which and the value proposition for flexible is that you can hit it with a hammer and it won't break. Now we're still working with CSIRO on that technology. In fact, Anita and I are on the same project on that.
Yeah.
And that's a really exciting technology that may one day overcome a lot of those challenges that you're talking about.
There's also lots of things that aren't or are insurable at the moment, so I'd be interested to know what the relative magnitude of these sorts of claims are. I just don't know about that. Yep.
Can the grid cope with that amount of solar?
Fantastic question. I'd probably want to be talking to the AEMO about that. But we did that modelling without considering grid constraints. So that's a caveat. It's an important caveat, but I think with energy storage systems, you could buffer it out. And it's not like we're producing, I guess it depends on the supply-demand aspect. So it's about levelising the electricity as opposed to redistributing it. So if we could levelise it, then we're not actually adding any additional capacity into the grid. Michael might actually be able to comment on that more. I mean, he works or considers that in a little bit more detail, but that would be my thinking around that. It's a good question.
I'm a mechanical engineer who sometimes pretends to be an electrical engineer, but there's all sorts of other smarts like the inverters and everything else that you can put in place. Just because there's a kilowatt of solar available doesn't mean you even have to take it and put it into the grid. So you can do all sorts of clever things. And that's a whole field of research that people at Monash and Melbourne and other universities that we're working together with local network operators on those kinds of things. So the hosting capacity, they call it, it can go up a lot just with a couple of clever uses of technology. So that itself is a rapidly evolving area, which I don't know much about at all. Okay, lots of hands coming up now.
Just a question about the actual commercial, like with the, I suppose, advocation of perovskite. Are other developers like Canadian Solar, Jinko, those kind of companies, are they looking into this as a future?
Yep. So I've got a student working for a big manufacturer, I can't say the name. So I think every single silicon manufacturer's got a little R&D department that's got people working on perovskites.
Secret squirrel.
Yeah.
Thanks very much for your talk. My question is to both panelists. Quite keen to hear what you guys think the role for big data, machine learning is in the context of smart solar and smart city, like utility scale transformation of the energy grid. Thanks.
I mean, I think they go hand in hand. Big data, you know, having the systems smart, as the title of this talk said, although I don't necessarily think we talked about the smart part of that grid, but your question really speaks to that. Understanding how that interplay between generation, storage and use, demand happens in the most feasible, efficient way that drives cost reductions and ultimately, you know, supports lower infrastructure adoption. I think that is a really important body of work and will predicate everything here, I think.
Yeah. And we're also talking amongst ourselves about using big data in terms of new solar material discovery. So perovskite being an example is like, whoa, you know, this material just pops up. And suddenly, can we find something that is similar to perovskite without the toxic material and last longer? Can we maybe somehow, you know, produce material in a faster way, in a high throughput way, and use the big data and machine learning to, explore new territories for material discoveries?
Well, that's a huge area, material discovery. Once again, something I don't know much about, but there is just such enormous data questions out there in working out what you should do. So if you're interested in doing work as a data scientist or whatever, there are lots of jobs perhaps that you can apply for. A couple more questions and then I think we should go and have a drink. Yes?
Yes, it was interesting before, Jack, you were comparing the huge uptake of homes with solar PV on their roofs. And are we getting similar uptake in that commercial, you know, CBD sector? And my suggestion is that a lot of homeowners are kind of sick of their electricity bills going up and they want control, so they're willing to pay that price. And so I guess my question for both you and Anita is, are the costs coming down? Because all the time we see new buildings built that are the status quo and they're not as good as they could be, perhaps because the building owner doesn't have to pay the running costs, the tenants do. Are the costs coming down to make it more feasible? And who's paying attention to you? Who are you talking to? Are there any people from that space that are watching what you're doing and expressing interest?
It's a good question. Did you want to...
I don't quite get the question, so I'll just hear your answer first.
I think when I said that, it was probably not a fair comparison because some of the big warehouses are actually doing that, which operate those warehouses, and there's clearly efficiency gains or energy savings to be had there. Internal to the city, which are the high-rise buildings, which have many consumers in there, and there's not one client, right? There's probably hundreds of clients in a building. I'm not sure whether the owners of that building, or in fact, I don't know if the builders of that building have thought about the energy implications of that build. And so there is a change, I think, in the construction building sector and trying to understand what's the evolution of solar photovoltaics integrate into these buildings. And also understanding what's the policy around that. Maybe if there's not, maybe there should be something, because there's a hell of a lot of wasted rooftop space around the CBD, which is just concrete, right? And we could be using it a little bit more effectively. And I certainly think that the costs are reducing, and Anita showed the cost reductions. And Michael also mentioned the point that the marginal difference, of the glass from what would be a facade or a glass to having that with solar panels is actually it's not that big. You know, it could be of the order of 20% or so. So really understanding when you are redeveloping a building, how does this new technology then start to play into your sustainability ratings, your energy ratings, your solar generation ratings? And I think all of those things need to align up. I don't think that's happening just yet, but it should. And to your second point, which is around who are we talking to, we're talking to a few people who are interested in commercialisation around that technology. We've talked to a few developers as well. We're hoping to start to talk to a few more councils, Melbourne Council and others, to just create awareness more than anything else at this point around the potential.
Yeah, so my answer to the first question, I don't know how to crack it really. I mean, we're technologists, but then, you know, developers do their thing and policymakers do their thing, and how can we have those people working together and where, you know, the basics or the building code and the standards actually encourage sustainability, and therefore the developers have to do that. I mean, in Sydney, we're worse, right? We have towers that are you know, that are so chunky that people have to move out and are not able to sell their buildings. So let alone renewable energy and sustainability. With regards to the second question, we actually, all of the projects, or I think 90% of our projects, we've got an industry partner we're working with. So the solar window one, we're actually working with a glass company as well as a solar cell material supplier where they make the perovskite precursors. And then with the tandem one, we're actually working with a company that is just want to produce tandem. So yeah, so that's why our focus is very sort of industry focused as well. Make sure what we develop is useful to them.
And there's also a lot of innovation in how buildings are paid for and contracted and serviced and so on. And that's the whole area that architects, builders, regulators are moving rapidly in. So you can imagine, you know, the old way, the bad old way of doing it is to build it as cheaply as possible and lump the owners and the tenants with the energy bill. And so you have a low-star building that's expensive to live in. And that's, a lot of that's changing by just much more sophisticated procurement and regulation. So there should be quite a lot of that. The funny thing is that with these shiny glass buildings that appeared post-war, they were built not because they were modernist acts of beauty, which some of them are, it's because they're cheaper than stone and other things to have all that glass. So if you can get power out of it, I really think that how that can change the total cost of and benefits of living in a big building is really quite substantial. One more question and then let's all have a drink. So there's one right in the middle here.
Thank you very much for your talks.
If you hang on 1 second, if you have the microphone, then we can record your question.
Thank you very much for your talks. I'm just wondering that what is the privilege of photovoltaic solar cells over silicon solar cells in terms of their lifetime? And what happens to them when they are damaged or they cannot get fixed? Are we just put them in the back of the garage as well? Or
so you're talking about the durability of perovskites?
Yes.
Yes, so
also
we want
about
to...
the recyclability. Like, could they be recycled?
Yes, so we definitely want to make sure they last as long as they can, and therefore we have, you know, a small research team and the really brave, courageous PhD students would go for the stability because it's, you know, it's not an easy problem to crack. For some of the niche applications, for example, for low Earth orbit satellites, maybe we can afford a shorter lifetime perovskite cells where it only lasts for 2 years. And recycling, that's a very good question. So there are publications coming out very recently talking about how to recycle. How do you get the lead out of the material, or make sure if there's anything happen to the cell, the lead won't leach out. So This is a very good organic chemistry question because most of the recycling comes from the organic parts of the solar cells. So yeah.
Comes from the what parts?
The organic part. Mm-hmm.
And in layperson's terms, that means not the silicon bit.
Yeah, not the, so anything that's got carbon in it and not the silicon bit. Not a metal bit.
Yeah. The backings, all the other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, I think we'll call it close. I think everyone probably could do with a mineral water, perhaps. And so we'll thank everyone. Thanks, Anita. Thanks, Jack. Thanks, everyone here tonight. Hopefully we're post-COVID normal and we're in a renewable energy zone. I thought North Fitzroy and Carlton was pretty much a renewable energy zone anyway. But let's make it a more renewable energy zone. So thanks, everyone. Good evening. Thank you.